Hello and welcome back to another video for EDTE 1000. This time we're going to be looking at Chapter 6 and I'm very excited about this one. We're going to be looking at the history of schools. I have to admit when I started this chapter, I wasn't sure how interesting it was going to be, but I have been fascinated and I've really enjoyed it. So I hope you enjoy all the visual aids and things I've put together for you as we cover Chapter 6, the history of schools. Okay, to get started in terms of objectives, we will be looking at the development of schools in the United States. We will be looking at historical events that greatly impacted the role of education in diverse groups. We're going to be looking at the professional lives of teachers in the early United States history and looking at different people and events and movements that shaped our curriculum. So let's get started. And again, we're going to be focusing on early American history. So that means obviously we're going to be starting with the colonies. The very first semblance of a school was something called a dame school. So a dame school occurred for children within a particular neighborhood. It was held in a woman's house. These were children typically between the ages of 6, and the woman would go about doing her chores and work for the day while keeping the children occupied with educational activities. Once they were finished at the dame school, the boys would have the opportunity to move forward with some sort of a skill or a trade apprenticeship. So whether they might be working for the town blacksmith or a woodworker to learn some sort of trade. Now, I did find this video. Keep in mind, some of these early American history videos are a bit dated, but it is trying to explain and give a feel for what these early dame schools and colony schools were like.
A child's first training outside the home came in the kitchen of a neighbor who kept a dame school. In communities where this was the only school, the child might attend from a few weeks to a year. And for a few pennies a week, she taught them the little she knew about numbers and letters, while going about her household tasks. The girls were taught to cook and to sew, and the formal education of many girls ended with the completion of her sampler. It was a sample of the girl's domestic skills, the only diploma she would ever receive, because most colonial schools and all colleges were closed to her. But for boys, the dame school gave the rudiments of instruction that preceded the reading and writing school. Here, religion was the core of the curriculum.
And this will be actually where we're moving into now. So, still looking at schools in the colonies. So, these early colonial schools, they were mainly run by the churches. So you might even see it as an advanced form of Sunday school, where the students studied reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as the Bible. The purpose of these early colonial schools was to continue and further their Puritan values. And it did start in New England. And so the curriculum that they used was called the New England Primer. You can still find copies of this in used bookstores. It's rather interesting to look at. So the New England Primer was the first widely used textbook. It covered the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, a list of books from the Bible, as well as, again, the reading, writing, and arithmetic. The first area to really require a formal education was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that was a pretty big deal for them to say, okay, we want all of our children to be educated. And the main reason for this was they wanted to make sure that they could read and understand the Bible, and that they could read and understand the laws of their county, country, or state. So let's continue. The next step in schools was something called the Latin grammar schools. There were many philosophers as well as leaders in the Puritan colonies who felt like the upper class children especially needed something more than those early colonial schools. They needed a better education so that they could become the future leaders of the colony. This cause was championed by many philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, Rene Descartes, John Locke. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Francis Bacon, just to name a few. So the Latin grammar schools, they were for young boys in the upper class. They taught Latin and Greek language, Latin and Greek literature, as well as the Bible. And this was seen as a much better education than what was going on at the traditional colonial school. But in general, the schools of the colonies all had a very similar purpose. The importance of knowing, understanding, reading your Bible scriptures, the necessity of having a citizenry that is educated, which will obviously become very important in a democratic society much later on down the road for the Americans. But some of those early philosophers I talked about, such as René Descartes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, believed that citizens needed to have certain basic skills, such as literacy and numeracy, in order for a democracy to thrive, in order to be able to make an educated decision when it comes to voting. And they also felt that a free and universal education was essential. Now, something else we need to consider during this time period was schools for the poor. I've mentioned the Latin grammar schools for the upper class citizens. There were schools for the poor that were called charity schools. And in order for a family to attend the charity school, they had to sign what was called a pauper's oath. And a pauper's oath was for you to publicly admit and sign and attest to the fact that you were poor, that you were living in poverty. So here's a question for you. How would you feel about having to publicly declare your poverty in order for you to send your kids to school? Well, you probably feel like the way a lot of these early colonists did. Most families did not want to do that. And so they simply kept their children at home. They would rather have illiterate children than publicly declare their poverty and feel full of shame because of that. Now, the next big movement in schools in the early U.S. was the common school movement. This is really the birth of the U.S. public school system. I also have the word secular in parentheses because what happened was after the Revolutionary War, the secular schools started to emerge because people started to feel like the church had too much control over the schools, and that perhaps this was limiting the influence of looking at scientific discoveries in school because perhaps we were focusing too much on the Bible. What are common schools? Basically a system of tax-supported schools. So again, this does sound a lot like our current public school system. Here's a short video we're going to watch talking a little bit about these early common schools.
The model of going to school to learn is relatively new. Before 1900, most children learned at home and out in the real world. In 1837, the state of Massachusetts formed the first state board of education, with Horace Mann as its secretary. Mann believed that everyone was entitled to the same content in education. Returning from a research trip to Germany in 1848, Mann lobbied heavily to have the Prussian model adopted. He quickly set about establishing a statewide system of common schools, staffed by professionally trained teachers. His ideas quickly gained momentum, and by 1852, Massachusetts passed a compulsory attendance law. Mann also believed that school could become a great equalizer, and values such as obedience to authority, promptness in attendance, and organizing time according to bell ringing would help students prepare for future employment.
And we'll see here where we start to look at how common schools were also related to what was happening during the time period with the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so common schools. The schools would be funded through taxation. There were a variety of issues that still need to be figured out, like whether or not attendance would be mandatory. And you can see from the video how in Boston they did declare that attendance would be mandatory for certain age periods. And then there were also questions about curriculum, the quality of curriculum, what should and shouldn't be included, how challenging it should be, and how uniform it should be across different areas. And in fact, you can even find where different states publish different manuscripts, ideas of what the common schools would look like for them. One of the things that did occur during these common schools was the separation of what was happening in schools and what was happening in churches, removing religion from the schools. Now, not everybody agreed with that. Here's an older political cartoon where they're pointing out that the new education, they saw it as rubbish rather than bread, speaking of bread for the soul, which is what the Bible would be providing you. And that instead of focusing on the Bible, if you're just focusing on these random topics listed like drawing and geology and the story, astronomy, anatomy, and so on, that isn't necessarily real bread, real food for the soul. Okay, so continuing with these common schools, two very important thinkers and politicians at the time, Jefferson and Franklin, they also believed in the importance of an educated citizenry, that people needed to be able to make good decisions, especially in a democracy, if they're going to be the ones who are making votes and helping to make things happen in the political system. So they felt like for a democracy to survive, the citizenry needed to be educated. So these two pictures are to simply show in a nutshell that change from a colony school to a common school. So over here, let's see, highlighter. So over here, you can see what was occurring in the colony schools. So they focused on the alphabet, they focused on sounds, and then on the church. So we have the Our Father here. And then here, moving into the common schools, where the focus was on things like the McGuffey readers. And the McGuffey readers was a way focusing more on reading, writing, and arithmetic. So recently, I visited an older school based on Roscoe School in Roscoe Village, Ohio. The school itself doesn't exist anymore, but they do have a small museum for it in Roscoe Village. So I went and took some pictures. So here you can see they had a series of the McGuffey readers. They had them both in the display cases as well as out on the teacher's desk. All around the room, they had posters that would be put up during that time period of the McGuffey readers that the students used to help them learn how to read. They had examples of what students might bring for penmanship, examples of supplies that the students would have, their slate as well as their pencil box and so on. And they had the room set up with all of the old desks. And you can see I had my daughter sit there and pose for you all. So if you do ever get a chance, it is interesting to visit these older schools. And even before the Constitution, people in the United States felt that it was important for the states to have control over the schools, over its curriculum, over its rules, not the federal government. The 10th Amendment did reinforce this idea. The 10th Amendment made it clear that education would be the responsibility of the states. I thought I'd ask the question, can you think of an example of a time when the federal government has attempted to control a school issue, something that is typically controlled by the states? Well, I do think some of these larger federal mandates might fit this scenario, such as Common Core. I think that is one of the things that a lot of people have difficulty about with Common Core, is the idea of this mandate coming down. Now, yes, states can choose whether or not they want to utilize the Common Core, but sometimes funding is connected to whether or not you utilize it. So people who work in schools and parents and citizens alike sometimes have difficulty when the federal government does try to control a school issue. All right, going back to our history. During this time period, while creating this public school system, mandatory attendance slowly started to become the norm. Between the time period of 1850 and 1918, all of the states slowly adopted mandatory attendance. Can you think of who might have a problem with that? These pictures are kind of a hint. Well, during that time period, children were part of the workforce. They were working in the factories. So child labor was a big obstacle to the idea of mandatory attendance because these kids had full-time jobs. And in fact, you can look at your textbook. It gives you some interesting facts when it comes to child labor. For instance, in North Carolina, 75% of the spinners, so the spinners are the people who are taking cotton or wool and turning it into thread, 75% of them were under the age of 14. So child labor Well, that's a big issue, and the industrialists certainly did not like the idea of these children now being forced to go to school. I found an interesting video I wanted to show you to kind of let you see a little bit of this time period and what it was like for these children.
In the early 1900s, the general population in those years had very little understanding of what was meant by child labor and child exploitation. The kinds of jobs you would find children working in ranged from the mines, the factories, the cotton mills, to working out on the streets selling newspapers. Injuries, even deaths, were very common among children. The parents would often say that they needed the income that their children brought in, that was what allowed them to continue to survive. A number of parents were advocates for child labor, and their children thought that that was the way life was. One of the first things the National Child Labor Committee did was to hire a photographer. They hired Lewis Hine, who was then their photographer for the next 2 decades. They sent him around the country to identify, find, and photograph children in exploitative situations. He promoted himself as a Bible salesman. He said he was bringing his camera along so he could photograph kids reading Bibles. A boy would say he was 13 when in fact he was 11, or a girl would say she was 12 when in fact she might be 9. The photograph is of a young girl, 10 or 11 years old. Her name was Sadie Pfeiffer, at a cotton mill in Lancaster, South Carolina. She's standing in front of a large loom on a long hallway, staring at and working hard on the job of selecting the quality products. She's probably worked most of the night. It's nearing the end of her shift. She stands there, iconic, as a representative of hundreds of other girls who are being treated just like her and who have no choice.
So, one of the things that occurred was, in tandem with the beginnings of this public school system with mandatory attendance, became child labor standards, which I think we can all agree was definitely needed during the time period and still today. I find it amazing that the first thing they did was hire this photographer to go out and take pictures, but they let him do this for 20 years before a change occurred. So it was really that deeply embedded into the society. All right, so we've seen this early development of schools. From here, we're going to be looking at the treatment of minorities. We're going to be looking at teachers, and then we're going to be looking at issues that relate to or influenced curriculum. Let's start with the treatment of minorities during this early period of the U.S. educational system. And we're going to start with the very first Americans, the Native Americans, the American Indians. So the early colonists believed that American Indians needed to be educated. They needed to learn Christianity. They needed to learn Anglo-Saxon culture, that they needed to be basically conformed or transformed into what the colonists believed. So here's my question for you. How do you think the Native Americans felt about that? That these invaders, for lack of a better word, come into their country and then say that they're demanding that they go to their schools, the Native Americans go to their schools to learn about Anglo-Saxon culture. Well, I'm sure you can probably guess they were strongly resistant to this because it wasn't just about learning Anglo-Saxon culture. They wanted them to drop their own culture in order to do this. Now, these first attempts at deculturalization were not effective. They just did not work. The Native Americans did not want to go to the schools. So, this is one of those times where the federal government stepped in. Congress passed what we call the Indian Civilization Fund Act to culturally transform the American Indians. Tribal schools were established. They brought in European missionaries to be the teachers at these tribal schools, to teach them the Bible, to teach them some of those early things that we saw in those early colonial schools. And interesting, one of the goals was that by transforming these Native Americans into Anglo-Saxon culture, you might be able to persuade them to sell their land to these Europeans. So there was a bit of an underhanded motive behind this. So, in 1867, the Indian Peace Commission stated that American Indians, they could become citizens. And they could become citizens if they gave up their native way of life, their native religions, and instead adopted the Puritan values, the Christian culture, and the Anglo-Saxon culture. I don't know about you all, but when I read that, this is exactly how I felt. I thought, wait a minute, you're telling the Native Americans, the people who've been here all along, that they can become citizens of their own country if they give up everything they believe? It seemed very wrong and counterintuitive. So what occurred was the federal government created boarding schools because, again, if you want to become a citizen, you've got to go to our schools. So they removed children from their tribes very early, put them in these boarding schools. The purpose of the boarding schools was not only to re-educate, to deculturalize the Native Americans, but to isolate them from their family, isolate them from their tribes, which makes it easier to then transform them, as you can see from these photos. I don't know about you, but there have been many aspects while going through this history of U.S. education that I have found really fascinating and sometimes upsetting, like these boarding schools. So I found a video so we could delve a little bit deeper into it.
They wanted to destroy our identity. And they put us on these boarding schools. I'm one of them that they put in these boarding schools. You know, destroy, kill the Indian, save the man. And over 100,000 children were taken from their homes and pulled. And in our family, and I'm fighting. Where am I going? Where am I going? You know, my mom and my grandma are right there, and I'm trying to hold on to them, and they come and take us apart. But that scene was, multiply that by 100,000 children that were taken by force from their mothers and from their grandmas and grandparents. That destroyed the language. Destroy the songs. Matter of fact, you couldn't sing any native song. You couldn't speak any native language. The vernacular would be English, and English only. That's how they wrote it up.
In the boarding schools?
Yeah. And there was corporal punishment there. But there was also, I was in a school where there was priests and nuns. And that was the first one, and I heard the screams, and I was part of the screams, and running away, and the beatings and the whippings by belts and leather and raping. I heard those screams. It was just...
I think we can all agree that this is difficult to watch and difficult to think about the way the Native Americans were treated. And also put it within a cultural perspective. Native American families did not believe in spanking or corporal punishment. That is not the way that they were raised. That is not what they believed. So then to put them in not only an environment that is stripping them of their culture, but treating them in a way that they're truly not used to, as well as abusing them. So finally, due to some complaints, the Red Cross did come in, and they started off with a boarding school in Arizona to investigate them. They found horrible conditions by poor diet. So an example of that, they found for breakfast, they had to live on black coffee, bread, and maple syrup. For dinner, they added potatoes to that diet. So horrible diet, overcrowded. There were diseases going through these boarding camps due to these conditions. So obviously, this was the moment when the federal government could come in and start to change things, even though they were also the ones who set it up. President JFK is known for making some great strides forward when it comes to our relationships with Native Americans. He was one of the first presidents to want to include Native Americans in important decision making. And then there was more forward progress made in 1968 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now this allowed for bilingual support, which was really quite a step forward because previously English was the only language allowed to be spoken in schools by the teachers or the students. So this allowed for that essential support for students for whom English was not their first language. And then in 1975, Congress gave tribes the right to establish and run their own schools to truly give them that self-determination when it comes to their children's education. Okay, so this will be where we stop for Chapter 6, Part 1. Part 2, we'll pick up on African Americans and their experience in the early education system. We'll be looking at the early role of teachers as well as influences on curriculum. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in Part 2.